My child, as long as you stay, I'll give you 1 billion, no, 2 billion. The Barnett family ancestral home. Grandpa Barnett sat on the yellow pearwood chair in the main hall, pleading with the girl before him, but Alyssa across from him shook her head, then pushed back that enormous check. Grandpa, I'm sorry. Our agreement was for 6 years, and now the time is up. I've repaid my debt, and it's time for me to leave. Her voice was soft, yet resolute, seeing Alyssa's determination. Grandpa Barnett could only sigh. You've suffered these years. Before you leave, tell me whatever you want. Alyssa remained silent for a long while before finally saying, I want you to approve of Clark and Ethel being together. You previously asked me to get close to Clark just to make him let go of Ethel. But now 6 years have passed, and as you've seen, perhaps true love simply cannot be torn apart. Hearing this, Grandpa Barnett heaved another heavy sigh. His eyes filled with exhaustion and helplessness. Enough, enough. I'm old now, I won't meddle in young people's affairs anymore. Let them do as they please. As for the divorce, child, you'll have to bring it up with Clark yourself. Alyssa nodded, bowed respectfully to the old man, then stood and walked toward the door. After getting into the car, she cast one last glance in the direction of the old estate. My first visit to this old mansion was to repay a kindness. She was a child from the orphanage, destined like the others to drop out of school, but fate smiled on her when she caught the eye of Grandpa Barnett, who sponsored her education through the Barnett family. Gifted and hardworking, she skipped grades relentlessly, earning her PhD from Peking University at just 22. The year she completed her studies, she made a special trip to the Barnett family mansion to thank Grandpa Barnett in person. He sat solemnly in his high-backed chair. Weariness etched across his face, and made her an unexpected request. Child, the Barnett family lacks no wealth. If you wish to repay kindness, grant me one request. From today onward, for the next 6 years, you must get close to the heir of my Barnett family, bear him a child, and make him let go of his sister. It was then that Alyssa learned Barnett family's heir Clark had fallen for his adopted sister, willing to abandon his position as heir just to defy morality and be with her. He had always been the most qualified heir since childhood, a prodigy favored by heaven, yet he rebelled so fiercely for a woman. The Barnett family was thrown into chaos, and to sever his attachment, they even sent Ethel abroad. But from then on, Clark drowned himself in alcohol day after day, utterly broken. Out of gratitude, she agreed. Afterward, she began approaching Clark, pursuing him obsessively, playing the role of a lovesick admirer until she finally married him and bore him a child. For 6 long years, she worked diligently without complaint, but recently, after Ethel returned to the country, his buried affections immediately reignited. Even their son, frequently taken to visit Ethel, developed fondness for Ethel and began resenting his own birth mother. So it turned out that white moonlight he never mentioned was also never forgotten. Fortunately, from now on, none of this would have anything to do with her. The Barnett family had only bound her for 6 years. And now the child had been born. At last, she could leave. Her wandering thoughts snapped back as her gaze returned to the car's interior, only to see an out-of-control truck barreling toward them the next second. Several loud crashing sounds followed in quick succession. Bang! The moment weightlessness struck. Her forehead slammed against the hard car seat. Excruciating pain assaulted her consciousness. Alyssa, her vision went black as she completely lost consciousness. When she woke again, the pure white ceiling and pungent smell of disinfectant reminded her where she was. The nurse making rounds noticed she was awake and asked some basic questions before sighing with relief. You're incredibly lucky, just minor concussion symptoms. That pile-up on the road brought in over a dozen patients. And you're the only survivor. After checking her vitals again, the nurse exhaled. No serious issues now. Have your family come sign the discharge papers, then you're free to go. She struggled upright, her entire being still numb with the terror of having narrowly escaped death. After a long while, she finally nodded, sat up, took her phone, and dialed Clark's number. The dial tone kept ringing, but there was no answer on the other end. Eventually, perhaps out of annoyance, the call was outright hung up. 1 call, 2 calls, 3 calls. Alyssa made over a dozen calls, but not a single one was answered. She lowered her eyes and tapped another number, her son Edward's. Time passed minute by minute, call after call was rejected. until finally, a message popped up on the screen. "Can you stop bothering me? I've got important things to do. Oh, and make some chicken soup at home." The impatient tone, the commanding attitude. Who could tell, without being told, that the sender was the son she had carried for 10 long months? Outside the hospital room, nurses passed by in the corridor, their gossiping voices drifting in. "Mr. Clark is too good to his wife. It was just a minor scald from hot water. The wound would have healed soon anyway. Yet he booked an entire floor, and that little young master is so well behaved and obedient, running around helping out." "You've got it wrong. That's not Mrs. Barnett, but Mr. Clark's adopted sister Ethel." Hearing this, another nurse quickly retorted, lowering her voice deliberately. "But you're new to LA and don't know Mr. Clark seems to have feelings for this sister. He once gave up his inheritance just to be with her, causing quite a scandal. It wasn't until Ms. Ethel was sent abroad that he married the current Mrs. Barnett." At this moment, Alyssa finally understood what the father and son had been busy with. She couldn't help but smile wryly. If she really died in this chain reaction car accident, would there even be anyone to claim her body? Raising her eyes to the nurse, she asked softly, "I'm sorry, but I have no family. Can I sign for myself?" Perhaps it was the first time she'd encountered someone with no family at all, for the nurse's eyes filled with pity before finally making an exception and handing her the discharge papers. She went through the discharge procedures alone. While picking up her medication, she passed by a hospital room where familiar voices caught her attention. Alyssa instinctively glanced inside and saw Clark and Edward both keeping vigil at Ethel's bedside, their faces displaying a tenderness and docility she had never seen before. She watched silently, her expression completely unchanged, as if the people inside weren't her husband and son at all. After a while, she finally looked away and turned to leave without hesitation. Returning home, Alyssa took out a divorce agreement from the drawer. At the final signature line, Clark's name flowed effortlessly across the page. In an instant, she seemed to see once more the way he had signed his name years ago. His eyes were distant, devoid of any emotion when they met hers. "Alyssa, I know you loved me desperately, but my heart belongs to another. I married you only because my family pressured me. If you ever want a divorce, just sign here. You're free to leave anytime." Now, she picked up the pen and hovered it over the space reserved for the wife's signature, signed her name without the slightest hesitation. As the final stroke of the pen touched paper, the door suddenly swung open. Turning her head, she saw Clark holding Edward's hand at the doorway. Father and son stood there dressed in matching black tailored suits, one large, one small. Their tall, jade-like figures exuding identical noble handsomeness as if carved from the same mold. "Why did you keep calling? Is the soup ready yet? All you do all day is handle some housework. Can't you even get that right?" Edward wore impatience plainly on his face. Alyssa ignored his tone and simply replied calmly, "It's warming in the kitchen." Having gotten his answer, he didn't hesitate for a moment. Releasing Clark's hand, he hurried straight to the kitchen. Clark stepped forward, his tone cool. "Edward is still young. I'll make sure he changes his attitude in the future." Alyssa paid no mind to his words. Edward was, after all, the child she'd carried for 10 months and risked her life to deliver. Though he'd always been rather cold toward her, he'd at least still called her mom before. But ever since Ethel returned, who knows what she said to Edward? Now Edward is convinced she's the villain who tore him and Ethel apart. His attitude has plummeted since then. He refuses to even look at her properly, let alone speak to her civilly. "No need," she shook her head. Then after a long pause, calmly met his gaze. "Clark, I've already signed the divorce papers. I don't want custody, nor alimony. Once the 1-month cooling-off period ends, I'll be gone." Before her words could fade, Edward came running back excitedly clutching a thermal lunchbox, his urgent voice completely drowning out her trailing words. "Dad, let's hurry to see Auntie. She must be so scared alone in the hospital room." Clark seemed to snap back to reality only then. Looking at her as he asked indifferently, "What did you just say? I didn't catch it." He spoke as if it were perfectly natural. Alyssa gazed at him, her mind involuntarily recalling how he had just been staring blankly in this direction, his eyes unfocused, his thoughts clearly wandering far away. So he hadn't been listening to her at all just now. So even though he had returned, The only person constantly weighing on his mind was Ethel in the hospital. At this thought, she stopped talking and simply shook her head at him, saying softly, "It's nothing, not that he cared anyway. Whether he knew about her leaving didn't matter anymore." Alyssa just watched as two figures, one large, one small, gradually disappeared through the doorway, making no attempt to stop them. Their absence lasted several days, which coincidentally gave Alyssa some free time. Seizing the opportunity, she submitted her application to the National Research Institute. As a genius who earned her doctorate at just 22, she would undoubtedly have become a pillar of the nation had she not married out of gratitude years ago. Now that her debt of gratitude was repaid and she had no other family ties, she was determined to fulfill her long-held aspirations. Several days after submitting her application, her phone suddenly rang. Picking it up, she saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. The voice on the phone was filled with thick surprise and excitement. Alyssa quickly recognized it as her former classmate. "Alyssa, are you really coming back? Everyone in our circle has heard about it. Back then, you were always the most talented among us, but then you suddenly disappeared." The professor kept sighing about what a pity it was. Now that he's heard you're returning, he hasn't slept for days out of joy. "We're all so happy for you. Looks like the entire academic world is about to be shaken." She detected the teasing tone in the words and smiled faintly, finally rediscovering a long-lost smile. "Don't worry, from now on I'll devote all my time to academia. As for everything else, I don't want any of it." Before the words had fully left her mouth, the door swung open. Clark and Edward chimed in simultaneously. "What don't you want anymore?" Caught off guard by their sudden return and the fact they'd overheard her phone call, Alyssa felt her heart skip a beat. She instinctively ended the call before turning to face them, masking the flicker of surprise in her eyes with practiced composure. "Nothing important, just some unused items I've been clearing out while organizing my room lately. Planning to throw them away in a couple days, don't need any of it anymore." Clark still felt something was off, his gaze fixed so intently on her it seemed capable of boring holes through her, yet she remained utterly composed, not a trace of guilt showing. Only then did he lower his eyes. Apparently he'd been overthinking things. "How did you all get back?" Seeing their suspicions dispelled, she seamlessly pivoted the conversation. As soon as these words were spoken, Edward didn't hold back at all and immediately started complaining and ordering her around. "I couldn't get used to the food or living conditions outside, so of course I came back. Aren't you going to cook? I want braised spare ribs." She frowned and instinctively turned her head to look at Clark, only to find him standing there silently, saying nothing. Yet the look in his eyes spoke volumes. Clearly, he thought the same as Edward. She pressed her lips together and turned toward the kitchen, suddenly feeling somewhat ridiculous. All these years, she had played both roles, nanny and wife, personally taking care of the father and son, terrified of displeasing them in any way. In the end, she had truly become the nanny in their eyes, devoid of respect or even a single word of gratitude. Alyssa had been busy alone for quite some time before finally bringing the dishes to the table. Watching the two of them naturally sit close together, she took her seat on the opposite side and suddenly spoke up. "Let's call back the old servants." Alyssa and Clark had many servants when they first moved into this villa. However, those servants never cooked to his liking. Nor did they care for him as well as Alyssa did. Moreover, Clark disliked having people around the house, so he sent all those servants back to the old residence. Clark frowned. This was the first time she had made a request. "Why, if I leave someday, there'll be no one to take care of you anymore. You'd better start getting used to it." She maintained her usual calm tone. Yet his frown deepened. "Leave? Where are you going?" Edward finally put down his chopsticks, his gaze carrying a barely concealed trace of disdain as he looked at her. "Are you upset because we've been busy taking care of Auntie lately? But where could you possibly go if you left us?" Clark gazed at her with profound intensity. Alyssa had never worked before, possessed no family background, and lacked formal education. Having left Barnett's household, where else could she possibly go without him? She wouldn't leave, never would. Neither father nor son took this episode to heart. Alyssa didn't offer further explanation either, merely sighing faintly. The meal concluded hastily, with no one bringing up the matter again. In the dead of night, Alyssa and Clark lay in the same bed, both wide awake. She had long grown accustomed to this life of sharing a bed but not dreams. keeping her distance from him with closed eyes and measured breaths. The space beside her suddenly dipped downward. Followed by an additional source of warmth, he naturally lifted his arm to wrap around her waist, his scorching breath brushing against her neck. Realizing his intention, Alyssa was just about to push him away when a low, husky voice sounded by her ear. "Ethel." The emotion in his voice was so thick it seemed almost tangible. In an instant, memories of every intimate moment they'd shared over the years flashed through her mind. How at the height of passion. The name that always escaped his lips was Ethel. A wave of irritation suddenly surged within her. She shoved him away forcefully, snapping him back to full awareness. Confusion flickered in his eyes. He couldn't fathom why she was acting this way again, just because of that Ethel. But this wasn't the first time, and he'd long since told her his heart belonged to another. What was she making a scene about now? Alyssa read his thoughts plainly. Without ceremony, she flipped off the bed, gathered a quilt in her arms, and strode toward the door. "I'll sleep in the guest room." Clark couldn't find the words to stop her, so he simply sat on the bed watching her resolute retreating figure. His usually composed face flickered with an indescribable restlessness. In the days that followed, neither was willing to yield first, leaving their relationship suspended in this lukewarm state, until Edward's birthday arrived, when Clark threw him a grand celebration. Many guests attended, and Ethel was among them. Alyssa sat in the corner, watching as her husband and son crowded around Ethel, showering her with warmth and attention. The intimate rapport among the three of them made it seem more like they were the family of three, rather than Alyssa, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Barnett, Mr. Edward. A few more people approached with glasses in hand, greeting them naturally before striking up conversations. Hearing this form of address, Clark paused momentarily. This was already the 56th person today who had mistaken their relationship. He instinctively glanced toward Alyssa's direction, only to see her lower her head imperceptibly, shielding all expression from view. His heart suddenly softened, and he took the initiative to explain, "Ethel is not Mrs. Barnett, she's my sister." Only then did those people finally react, hastily offering apologies. After leaving, the group gathered together to discuss. "I saw Mr. Clark constantly hovering around that woman named Ethel, so I assumed she was Mrs. Barnett. Turns out she's not. So where's the real Mrs. Barnett?" An insider pointed him toward Alyssa. "There, that one over there. This is just too tragic." At his son's birthday banquet, both husband and son are gathered around another woman. Alyssa pretended not to hear, her expression remaining calm. It wasn't until the gift-giving segment that she stepped forward, taking out a key and handing it to Edward. "I've locked your gift in the safe. Open it, and you'll see." The safe contained birthday gifts she had prepared for Edward for decades to come. After all, once she and Clark finalized their divorce, she would never see him again. But when the key was handed to him, Edward didn't even glance at it. He flung the key aside with a dismissive toss of his head, his tone dripping with contempt. "I don't have time for this nonsense." "Don't speak to your mother like that." Clark frowned, scolding softly before turning back to look at Alyssa. "The child is still young. Don't take it to heart." She remained silent, forcing a faint smile. The child is indeed young, but that's no excuse for treating his own mother this way. How indifferent must he be to her, to always brush her off with excuses about the child being too young. As he spoke, Edward had already run up to Ethel, his eyes full of anticipation. "Auntie, what gift did you prepare for me?" Ethel smiled and took out her prepared gift, a storybook. It wasn't even wrapped, clearly just bought casually. Edward happily took it nonetheless, grinning so wide his eyes nearly disappeared. "Thank you, Auntie. I love it so much. I'll definitely take good care of it." After presenting the gifts, it was time for the wish-making ceremony. Edward stood before the extravagant cake, closed his eyes, and clasped his hands together. The next moment, he opened his mouth, and his childish voice reached everyone's ears. "I wish Auntie could be my mommy and stay with Daddy forever." As the words fell, the room erupted into noise. After a brief silence, Clark also froze for a moment before scolding, "Don't talk nonsense." He wasn't afraid either, just blinked his eyes and pouted, unwilling to back down. "Doesn't Dad want to be with Auntie? I saw it all in the study. Your drawer is full of love letters written to Auntie. And you've kept every single photo of her. Every page of the books on your shelf is covered with Auntie's name. Alyssa is just a nanny. So why can't she step aside for you and Auntie?" As soon as these words were spoken, Ethel suddenly turned her head to look at Clark, her eyes quickly welling up with tears, her eye rims turning crimson. "Brother, you've never forgotten me all these years, have you?" Clark awkwardly avoided her gaze, remaining silent, but she persisted relentlessly. "I just want an answer, brother." As the last syllable fell, her tears finally streamed down her cheeks, striking heavily at his heart and completely softening it. Love poured forth uncontrollably as he spoke. The long-hidden answer in his heart could no longer be concealed. "Yes. There hasn't been a single moment when I've forgotten you." As Clark's words fell, the scene plunged into complete silence. Suddenly, a crashing sound echoed through the entire banquet hall. Everyone instinctively turned toward the source of the noise, only to discover that someone had accidentally knocked over the champagne tower, and unfortunately, Ethel was standing right where it was collapsing. "Ethel, Auntie!" Clark and Edward cried out in shock. Alyssa watched helplessly as the father and son frantically rushed toward Ethel, who was too panicked to move out of harm's way. Standing nearby, she became nothing more than an obstacle in their rescue path. Brushed aside with rough shoves, she instantly lost her balance and fell backward. The next moment, cascading wine and shards of broken glasses rained down upon her. The dripping alcohol soaked her hair, and her dampened evening gown clung tightly to her skin. Her hands and legs were covered in ghastly, bleeding wounds, each sting a cruel reminder of her humiliation and misery. The rapid loss of blood caused her consciousness to blur momentarily, leaving her dizzy-headed with a vacant stare fixed ahead. Opposite her stood Ethel, still surrounded by the anxious faces of Clark and Edward. "Auntie, your hand is bleeding." "Ethel, I'm taking you to the hospital." Clark didn't hesitate for a second before scooping up Ethel and carrying her outside. Edward struggled to keep up with his short legs, yet uttered no complaint. Ethel wrapped her pale arms around Clark's neck, though there was only a small wound on her arm. To their eyes it might as well have been a grievous, irreversible injury. As the group hurried past Alyssa, Clark glanced instinctively in her direction. Only when he saw the numerous wounds covering her body did he belatedly remember someone he'd seemingly pushed aside moments ago. His movements paused briefly as he looked at her, his tone devoid of any remorse. "I need to take Ethel to the hospital first. As for your injuries, take a cab and get them checked yourself." Alyssa opened her mouth, but before she could utter a word, Clark and the others had already walked straight out of the banquet hall, left lying in a pool of blood. She had no choice but to pull out her phone and with great difficulty call for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived quickly, as she lay on the stretcher, about to be wheeled into the operating room. Clark and Edward hurriedly rushed over, their faces filled with anxiety. "Ethel has a bleeding disorder and can't stop losing blood. She's already passed out. The blood bank doesn't have enough supply. I remember you share her blood type. Come with me to donate blood now." As he spoke, Clark reached out to grab Alyssa. Seeing this, the doctor quickly stepped forward to stop him, looking somewhat troubled. "Mr. Clark, Mrs. Barnett's injuries are more severe, and she's currently too weak to receive a blood transfusion." Yet these words failed to evoke even a shred of pity from Clark. His brow remained tightly furrowed, his movements never pausing, while even Edward stood by pursing his lips, his tone dripping with indifference. "What's the harm in giving just a little blood? How could she possibly compare to Auntie?" Her entire body ran cold as ice. Trembling, she turned her head to look at them, two figures, one large and one small, meeting her gaze without the slightest trace of guilt. Alyssa had long grown accustomed to their indifference, yet hearing such words still made her heart ache unbearably. For 6 years, she had worked tirelessly to care for their father and son, even if she didn't expect them to love her as much as they loved Ethel. How could they say such things? She was dragged out of bed, stumbling all the way to the blood donation room. The sting of the needle piercing her vein paled in comparison to the pain in her heart. As more and more blood was drawn, dizziness washed over her again, and her lips gradually turned pale. She couldn't take it anymore and stood up to leave, when suddenly a shadow appeared before her and her hands were forcefully pinned down. Turning her head, she realized it was Clark and Edward who had pinned her hands on either side. "We need to draw more blood for Ethel's safety." Clark's voice had barely faded when Edward's voice immediately followed. Draw harder. You must ensure Auntie's safety." Their faces were filled with worry and anxiety for Ethel, completely disregarding Alyssa, who was having her blood drawn. As they urged the nurse to take more, the already injured and weakened Alyssa could endure no more and finally fainted completely. When she woke again, Clark and Edward were unusually by her bedside, seeing her awake. Their cold eyes held a trace of complex emotions. After a long silence, Clark was the first to speak. "I didn't know you had anemia. Why didn't you say something?" Hearing this, Alyssa could only smile bitterly. They had dragged her straight to donate blood without giving her a chance to explain, let alone, "Did I say it? And you wouldn't let me donate blood anymore." As the words fell, the air instantly sank into silence. He didn't answer, yet the answer was already obvious. They would still make her donate blood, just like when they dragged her to donate blood. Her wounds hadn't yet healed. The doctor had kindly advised them, warning that she was too physically weak to donate blood at that time. How had they responded back then? "This time it's my fault. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you." His thin lips moved slightly, his usually cold voice finally carrying a trace of guilt, no longer as harsh as before. Alyssa closed her eyes and replied hoarsely, "What I wanted most, I've already gotten it now." Clark cleared his throat lightly, his expression becoming somewhat awkward at these words. She felt inexplicably puzzled, but when she saw his expression, she suddenly froze before snapping back to reality. In his heart now, Alyssa was still the same Alyssa who loved him desperately, who would do anything for him just to earn a single glance. Alyssa, in his mind, what she wanted most was naturally him, and their marriage. Yet only she knew what she spoke of was none of those things, but freedom. After hesitating for a moment, he opened his mouth again, about to say something when a nurse pushed the door open and walked in. "Mr. Clark, MS, Ethel." At these words, Edward couldn't sit still any longer. He quickly stood up and began urging Clark, "Dad, let's hurry up and go. She's already fine. What's the point of staying here? Look how rosy her complexion is. There's nothing wrong with her. She just faked a faint to gain sympathy. We should go see Auntie instead. She's terrified of pain and lost so much blood. She must really need us right now." His sleeve kept being tugged at. Clark helplessly got up. When he reached the hospital room door, he suddenly stopped, turned to look at her, his tone carrying a hint of resignation. "I'll come back to see you later." With those words, he turned away and never looked back. The Clark and Edward who said they'd return later never came back after leaving. Alyssa lay resting when her phone suddenly chimed with a message notification. She clicked to look and saw Ethel had sent her a photo. In the picture, Clark was holding a bowl of porridge, scooping a spoonful to feed her, his gaze so tender it could drown a person. In another photo, Edward sat at the foot of her bed, obediently massaging her legs. "You saw the scene at the birthday party. Clark still has me in his heart. Your child likes me too. You're just a nanny, so step aside already." The provocative words fell into her eyes without stirring the slightest ripple of emotion. After a pause, Alyssa typed a few words and sent them back. "Don't worry, soon, I'll hand them all over to you." "What do you mean?" The reply came quickly. But no matter how many more questions she asked or how many messages she bombarded them with, she never got another response. A few more days passed. Alyssa had fully recovered. On the day of discharge, Clark came to pick her up, and Ethel was discharged alongside her. After completing the discharge procedures and about to get in the car, a man and a woman happened to walk out of the hospital together, heading straight toward the car parked next to theirs. After placing the luggage in the back seat, the man first opened the passenger door, then dramatically bent down. "Reserved seat for my wife. Please get in." The woman playfully slapped his arm, though her eyes clearly sparkled with delight. Who wouldn't love such blatant favoritism? Clark clearly overheard that conversation too, his hand pausing momentarily as he pulled open the passenger door. Ethel walked up cheerfully and grabbed his free hand, glancing at the car door he'd opened with an intimate, natural familiarity. "Bro, did you open this just for me?" He nodded, but his gaze uncontrollably drifted toward Alyssa on the other side. Countless thoughts churned in his mind. He had imagined many possible reactions from her. Would she be angry, heartbroken, or perhaps both? Yet, among all the possibilities he had considered, he never expected her to calmly open the backseat door herself, as if she hadn't heard those words about the wife's seat at all. Perhaps when they got married, He had already told her that his heart belonged to someone else, but Alyssa loved him too much, so all these years she had been obedient and docile. Never fighting or competing for anything, nor daring to hope for anything from him. Just like now, knowing Ethel occupied his heart, she wouldn't insist on asserting her role as his wife in front of others. Yet for some reason, at this moment, Clark felt an inexplicable unease. "Brother, it's terrible, I think I left my necklace in the ward, it's really important, the one you gave me for my 18th birthday." Just as she was about to get into the car, Ethel suddenly spoke with some annoyance, successfully drawing the attention of both Clark and Edward. Hearing this, Clark turned and walked back toward the hospital. "I'll go find it for you, wait here." Edward saw him leave first and hurriedly followed. "Dad, I'm coming too." As their figures gradually disappeared into the crowd, Ethel turned back and looked at Alyssa again, lifting her chin with a disdainful tone. "You're quite composed, still unwilling to leave even in this situation. Alyssa, if I were you, I'd obediently tuck my tail between my legs and scram as soon as possible." Alyssa had no time to indulge her theatrics, nor was she willing to listen to her barking here, not even sparing her a glance. Little did she expect that this attitude would fuel the other's rage even more. With vicious words pouring out one after another, Alyssa remained indifferent until suddenly, the sharp sound of a slap rang in her ears. She turned her head to see Ethel, now bearing a red slap mark on her face. "Alyssa, what happened between me and my brother is all in the past. If you dislike me so much, can't I just stay out of your sight from now on? Why did you have to hit me?" The next second, Clark and Edward rushed over like a gust of wind, shoving her violently to the ground. Seeing Ethel crying pitifully, Edward became even more furious. He strode over to Alyssa, who had been pushed down, and slapped her several times. "So just because we drew a little blood from you, you'd go this far to take revenge on your aunt? You're truly vicious." Alyssa never expected Edward to suddenly strike, yet he actually succeeded. Perhaps he truly hated her to the core, for those slaps were delivered with full force, leaving her head spinning and her cheeks burning with searing pain. "Edward, enough." Only after Edward had vented his fury did Clark coldly call him to stop. When Clark turned his gaze to her, his eyes were icy, devoid of any emotion. She couldn't tell whether her face or her heart hurt more. By the time she finally gathered herself to explain, even her voice had grown hoarse. "Clark, Edward, I didn't hit her. There are surveillance cameras here. You can check for yourselves if you don't believe me." But neither father nor son paid any attention to her words. They supported Ethel on either side as they helped her into the car, not bothering to see if she got in or not, leaving her standing there as they drove away. Watching the car speed off, kicking up clouds of dust, she couldn't help but laugh at herself bitterly. How could she still think of explaining herself in front of Ethel? She had been too naive. Alyssa returned home to find the house completely empty. As expected, Clark and Edward had both gone to Ethel's place. Gazing at the lifeless villa, she flipped through the calendar and suddenly remembered the 3-day cooling-off period for divorce would end soon. Finally, she could leave them behind completely. From now on, the sky would be vast enough for birds to fly freely, and the sea wide enough for fish to leap boundlessly. She would have no further ties with them. 3 days before departure, Clark and Edward didn't return, but Alyssa received a video. In the video, Clark, who had never lifted a finger for housework, personally cooked a table full of dishes, while the usually spoiled Edward peeled fruits and served them to Ethel. After 6 years of marriage to Clark, this was the first time she learned that he could actually cook, and that Edward could obediently peel fruits for someone. She turned off the video, removed the wedding ring she had worn on her ring finger for 6 full years, then took out Edward's childhood scribbles she had always kept in her bedside drawer and threw them all into the trash. On the second day before departure, Alyssa received the second video. In the video, Clark, Edward and Ethel stood amidst a sea of purple lavender. Clark couldn't hide the love in his eyes. "Ethel, you said you loved lavender, so I planted this entire field for you with my own hands. Do you like it?" She nodded shyly. Beside her, Edward tugged at her skirt and held up a purple floral wreath. "Auntie, I picked the prettiest lavender flowers and spent forever weaving this wreath for you." Alyssa watched the video calmly, then gathered all the gifts she had previously given to Clark and Edward from every corner. Layers of dust had settled on them, with most remaining unopened. She threw all those gifts into the fire. letting them burn to ashes. On the final day of her countdown to departure, Alyssa received a third video. In the video, Clark and Edward were lavishly spending fortunes at an auction for Ethel. Whatever Ethel took a fancy to, no matter how expensive, Clark would bid for it without hesitation. Only when Ethel frowned slightly, Edward would rush to warm her hands and feed her fruit. In the eyes of both father and son, she was the only one that mattered. Alyssa closed the video expressionlessly, then went out to get her divorce certificate. Upon returning, she erased every trace of herself in that house. On the day of departure, Alyssa had packed all her belongings. Just as she was about to leave, Clark and Edward, father and son, suddenly pushed the door open and walked in. The first words they spoke upon returning were to demand an apology from her. "Today is Ethel's birthday. Since you hit Ethel last time, you should go apologize to her." Alyssa stood perfectly still where she was, her expression calm as she watched the father and son pair. For some inexplicable reason, both Clark and Edward felt their heartbeats quicken with uncontrollable unease. "You're the one who was wrong, shouldn't you apologize?" Clark had barely spoken when Edward, as if finding his anchor, tightly gripped his hand and chimed in, "That's right, you hit Auntie, so you should apologize to her." Alyssa still just watched them silently, saying nothing. Just when Clark and Edward thought she would remain stubbornly silent, she suddenly turned away. "I understand, you two go ahead first." Clark paused momentarily, then his brows suddenly furrowed after hearing her words. "You're not coming with us. Since it's a birthday banquet, I'll need to change into formal attire and do my makeup. Don't you hate waiting the most? Besides, Ethel's birthday surely means she'd want you present from the very beginning." Her expression remained composed as she spoke logically, leaving Clark speechless. Edward glanced at her several times before grumbling again. "You cook at home every day, what's the point of wearing makeup?" Alyssa paused mid-step, her gaze darkening momentarily before she turned to face him directly and replied, "The slap marks you left need covering up." In an instant, Edward flashed a guilty look in his eyes and dared not speak further. Humiliated, he sulked and grabbed Clark's hand to leave, but she suddenly spoke up, calling them back again. The two turned around to see her emerge from the room holding a gift box, which she handed to them. "This is a gift I prepared for Ethel. Please deliver it during the gift-giving segment, and remember, it must be played on the spot." Inside it contained the hospital surveillance footage from that day. Since they refused to look, she would show it to everyone present. Alyssa emphasized the words "on the spot." Clark, who, though somewhat puzzled, still agreed. After receiving the gifts, the father and son turned again to walk toward the door. "Edward," suddenly, she spoke up, calling out Edward's name. Seeing him turn around with renewed impatience, she softly uttered two words, "Goodbye." After a pause, she then looked at Clark and the tall figure beside him, bidding farewell as well. "Clark, goodbye." Clark turned back to see Alyssa standing under the light, backlit. Her expression was now hard to discern, but he could just make out the faint smile on her face. He was momentarily stunned, since when had her figure become so gaunt, as if a gust of wind could carry her away. Carry her away from the Barnett household, or even, carry her out of his world. But after just a moment, he dismissed the thought himself. Alyssa loved him so much. How could she leave? It had been 6 years, and she hadn't left. No matter who walked away, she never would. Suppressing the inexplicable unease rising in his heart, he didn't dwell on it further. Nodding, he picked up the gift box with one hand, held Edward's hand with the other, and turned to walk out of the villa's front gate. Only after watching Clark and Edward both leave the villa did Alyssa withdraw her gaze, turn back into the room, and push her already packed luggage out through the villa's gate. She walked to the roadside, hailed a taxi, and stated her destination after getting in. The next moment, the car started and sped away in the direction completely opposite to where Ethel's villa was located. Clark, Edward, goodbye. And so, they never saw each other again. On the other side, Clark sat in the speeding car. Yet an inexplicable unease crept into his heart. He kept turning around, wanting to see if Alyssa had caught up, his gaze falling on that gift box before he couldn't help but frown again. Even the gift had to be delivered by him. Just how late did she plan to be? Wasn't it just changing clothes and doing makeup? How much time could that possibly take? He began searching through his memories, trying to recall how long she used to take getting ready when going out in the past. all the while thinking that if she normally didn't need this much time, she must be trying to avoid apologizing. He wouldn't let her have her way, but upon careful reflection, in their 6 years of marriage, she had indeed rarely worn makeup. Perhaps it really was as Edward had said, that she spent her days cooking and taking care of them at home, or perhaps she simply didn't care for dressing up. He truly couldn't remember how long her makeup routine used to take. When the car finally came to a stop, Edward waited for a long time but saw no movement from Clark, so he fumbled to open the door himself and jumped out first. Seeing that Clark still showed no intention of getting up, he couldn't help but climb back in and tug at his sleeve. "Dad, we're here. Time to go find Auntie." After calling several times with no response from the person inside the car, Edward raised his voice even louder, his tone growing sharper. Clark finally snapped out of his daze. Looking at the villa gate outside the car window, he realized they had already arrived at Ethel's villa. He got out of the car holding the gift box, feeling somewhat melancholy. "Dad, what are you thinking about so deeply?" Edward tugged at him, wrinkling his nose unhappily. It was only upon hearing this question that Clark suddenly snapped out of his thoughts, realizing that throughout the entire journey, only one person had occupied his mind, Alyssa. She could actually unsettle her own mind to such an extent. Clark felt a strange flicker in his heart. Edward, noticing his distraction again, tugged at his hand to show his displeasure. Only then did Clark shake his head abruptly. "It's nothing." The reply was rather perfunctory. But fortunately Edward was now entirely preoccupied with meeting Ethel, so he didn't press the matter further. Yet for some reason, ever since seeing Alyssa, his heart had been pounding uncontrollably. Restless and uneasy, as if something had been torn from within his chest, he wanted to grasp it, but couldn't hold on. Even after arriving at the banquet hall and seeing Ethel, this feeling didn't diminish in the slightest. He kept glancing toward the entrance, constantly checking the time. The longer it went on, the more visibly agitated he became. Ethel noticed his restlessness but couldn't pinpoint its source. Yet after turning it over in her mind, it seemed there was only one improbable possibility left. A venomous glint flashed in her eyes. Since Alyssa was so stubborn, having been told repeatedly to step aside yet refusing, even daring to scheme her way into Clark's attention, then later, she would give her another grand gift. Ethel looked up, her expression softening back into a sweet smile as she lifted her skirt and walked over to Clark. "Brother, you seem so distracted, and Alyssa still hasn't come over. Is something urgent keeping her? If you're worried, you should go find her. It's fine if you don't stay with me at the birthday party." She put on a picture of understanding and obedience, yet her tone carried unmistakable grievance, tugging at heartstrings and making everything else seem trivial. Clark felt his heart soften, and his expression unconsciously gentled. What could possibly be more important? "Of course I'll stay with you on your birthday." Edward also moved closer to her with a smile. "That's right, Auntie, nothing matters more than your birthday today. Don't worry, none of us are leaving. When that woman arrives, we'll make her apologize to you publicly." Even though Edward wasn't calling Alyssa Mom for the first time, this was even a result he himself had indulged somehow. Hearing Edward refer to Alyssa as that woman suddenly stirred an inexplicable displeasure within him. He was about to reprimand them, but the sight of Ethel and Edward getting along so harmoniously made the words stick in his throat, unable to come up or go down, leaving him unbearably uncomfortable. After a long pause, he sighed and said, "Let's head to the banquet hall first." The birthday celebration soon reached the gift-giving segment. One priceless gift after another was presented to Ethel, greatly satisfying her vanity. When it was Clark's turn, he hesitated for a moment before finally taking out the gift Alyssa had entrusted to him. "This is Alyssa's gift for you. She insisted it must be played immediately, so let's see what she's prepared first." He unwrapped the gift box, revealing a small USB drive inside. Taking it out, he handed it to a servant to have it played. Ethel didn't stop them. She was also curious to see Alyssa's next move under these circumstances. She held her head high, her brows still betraying traces of unconcealed disdain, until suddenly the large screen at the center of the banquet hall lit up, drawing the gaze of every guest present. As the loading bar inched closer to 100, not just Ethel, but everyone was curious about what Alyssa, who had relentlessly pursued Clark for 6 years, would reveal at the birthday banquet of his true beloved. Was it sweet memories of her and Clark? But there had never been any affection between them. After all, who in LA didn't know that the CEO of Barnett Group loved his adopted sister, and his marriage was merely one of convenience, or perhaps sincere words of blessing? If so, they'd likely just scoff at her feigned magnanimity. The lengthy loading time finally ended, and the image appeared on the large screen, looking like surveillance footage. What's this? Looks like surveillance footage. What's Alyssa doing with surveillance footage? As everyone buzzed with confusion about Alyssa's intentions, Ethel on stage suddenly paled upon recognizing the familiar scene. Was this the surveillance footage from the day she framed Alyssa for hitting her in the hospital's underground parking lot? Clark didn't recognize it at first either, but soon, he saw the scene where Ethel, Edward and Alyssa appeared together. Not much time had passed since the incident, and both Clark and Edward still wanted Alyssa to apologize to Ethel for what happened that day. Now, with this familiar scene flooding their minds, father and son reacted instantly. Turn it off now. Ethel suddenly let out a piercing scream and impulsively hurled her wine glass at the screen. Wait. The servants present were startled by her outburst and were about to call someone to turn it off when Clark stopped them. Edward also looked at Ethel in bewilderment. Unable to comprehend her extreme agitation, Clark and Edward had never truly doubted the truth of that day's events. In their hearts, Ethel was gentle and kind. How could she possibly frame someone? Thus, when confronted with this surveillance footage, their initial reaction was still anger. They were just demanding Alyssa to apologize, yet she insisted on making this matter known to everyone. But what good would it do her to escalate things? Edward didn't overthink it, though still puzzled. He patiently comforted Ethel. Auntie, don't be afraid. If she wants to make a scene, let her. Does she really think she can ruin your birthday banquet? What wishful thinking. Since she wants to expose herself, let everyone see just how malicious she truly is. He spoke indignantly, completely unaware that behind him, Clark and the other guests had begun to exchange strange looks. Who would ruin their own reputation just to sabotage a birthday party? Sure enough, the video soon showed Clark and Edward leaving one after another, while the camera remained focused on Ethel and Alyssa. Due to the distance, the audio sounded somewhat distorted, yet Ethel's shrill voice still pierced clearly through to everyone present. You're quite composed, still unwilling to leave even in this state. Alyssa, if I were you, I'd obediently tuck my tail and scram as soon as possible. If I hadn't been sent abroad for a few years, do you think the position of Mrs. Barnett would have fallen to you? Look at your own face. Look at your own attire, a disheveled housewife. What makes you think you can compete with me? One vicious provocation after another. Though Alyssa's expression couldn't be seen clearly in the video, Ethel's twisted face was exposed vividly. Alyssa hadn't even lost her temper yet, but off-screen, the uproar was already deafening. Who would have thought that Ethel, who always put on airs of being a refined young lady in public, was secretly the kind of homewrecker who bullied the original wife out of the picture and flaunted her victory? But what shocked them even more was when Ethel suddenly slapped herself across the face. A red palm print quickly bloomed on her fair cheek, with tears welling up in her eyes. She looked pitifully aggrieved as she tearfully accused Alyssa of hitting her. The next second, Clark and Edward finally returned. Hearing these words and seeing the slap mark on Ethel's face, they suddenly erupted in rage. One pushed her to the ground, while the other slapped his own mother 10 times fiercely. In the end, even when Alyssa explained she hadn't laid a hand on anyone and that there were surveillance cameras as proof, all three of them stormed off without a second glance, not bothering to listen to a word she said. The murmurs abruptly ceased, but all eyes turned to the center where Clark, Edward, and Ethel stood. The Barnett family group, as La's preeminent dynasty, commanded such influence that most enterprises and families present relied on the Barnetts for patronage. They might gossip about the Barnetts' adopted daughter, but dared not openly criticize the group's current CEO or its heir apparent at such an occasion, yet most eyes still carried veiled contempt. They despised Ethel for her mistress-like behavior, and equally scorned Clark for striking based solely on Ethel's accusations, as well as Edward's act of slapping his own birth mother over mere slander. Under the gaze of everyone present, the Barnett family of three all flushed red, among whom Clark felt particularly humiliated. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, But after scanning his surroundings repeatedly without seeing the person he hoped for, he finally remembered, oh right. She hadn't arrived yet, which was why she'd asked him to deliver this gift on her behalf. Overwhelming guilt suddenly washed over him. I didn't know, he stammered, I thought. Beside him, Edward had long been stunned. Edward hated Alyssa, even resenting the fact that she was his biological mother. Because Dad said that after Grandpa sent his true love abroad, he brought Alyssa to his side and forced them to marry. He said he was compelled to marry Alyssa. He said his true love was his kind and innocent foster sister who lived thousands of miles away, but their feelings were forbidden by society, forcing him to reluctantly choose submission. Edward believed Alyssa was nothing but a thief and robber who forcibly inserted herself between his father and aunt. Without Alyssa, his kind and innocent aunt would have been his mother. Yet only when this video was made public did he realize his entire understanding of good and evil seemed to have suddenly collapsed. So that day, it wasn't her who hit Auntie. He looked up blankly at his longtime support, only to see Clark mirroring the same bewilderment in his eyes. How could it be? How could the truth of the matter turn out like this? Clark suddenly looked up, his gaze locking onto Ethel, who was trying to slip away unnoticed. It was as if he'd finally found his outlet. All his pent-up rage came pouring out in an instant. Why did you lie? I trusted you so much, Ethel. How could you become like this? His face was filled with anguish and regret. Edward immediately chimed in. That's right, Auntie. Why did you lie to us? Haven't we been good enough to you? Seeing them all shift the blame onto her, Ethel wore an expression of utter disbelief, but remembering the surrounding guests, she swallowed her anger again and again, tears streaming down her face like pear blossoms in the rain. No, that's not it. Let me explain. Bang bang bang. Suddenly, a burst of applause erupted from below the stage, startling all the guests present. Their eyes instinctively swept across the room, searching for whoever had dared to clap at such a moment. Clark and Edward also froze momentarily before turning toward the source of the voice. The man stood up, his eyes slightly narrowed, brimming with amusement, a faint curve playing at the corner of his lips. When he spoke, his voice was laced with playful mockery. We really ought to thank this Mrs. Barnett for treating us to such a fine spectacle. Gary, Clark's face froze instantly upon recognizing the man, his eyes burning with even greater fury. At that moment, what flooded his mind was not only anger at Ethel's deception, but also irritation toward Alyssa for blowing things out of proportion. Why couldn't she have explained it to him privately? Why did she have to use such an absolute method to publicly humiliate them? No one gave him any explanation, and when others saw who was speaking, they all shared the same feeling of sudden realization. The Barnetts had few rivals in LA, but the Rodericks were one of them. And Gary had never gotten along with Clark since childhood, opposing him at every turn and taking pleasure in seeing him humiliated. Under such circumstances, he was indeed the only one bold enough to pull such a stunt. Gary, having enjoyed the show, leisurely turned and left the banquet hall, giving Clark no chance to retaliate. The banquet had descended into chaos, and with Gary leading the way out, the other guests didn't dare linger either. They all excused themselves and left early under various pretexts. In the blink of an eye, the once lively banquet hall was left with only Clark, Edward and Ethel among a few others. The banquet had already ended. Yet she still hadn't shown up. It was clear she had deliberately separated from them to avoid attending. At this point, Clark couldn't possibly fail to understand they had all been played by Alyssa, with layers of pent-up fury and only the three of them present. Clark suppressed his earlier anguish, his eyes darkening with malice. Then he raised his hand, and a sharp, crisp sound followed. Ethel was caught off guard by the sudden, unrestrained slap, her head snapping to the side. After a moment of stunned silence, disbelief flooded her even more intensely. You hit me, Clark, you hit me. Tears of grievance instantly welled up. This time they weren't part of an act, but genuine hurt. Facing her aggrieved and questioning gaze, Clark felt none of his former tenderness. Since you kept slapping yourself, I thought you enjoyed being hit. He curled a smile, yet it didn't reach his eyes. As the words fell, Edward suddenly threw himself forward with tears in his eyes, using all his strength to beat against her until Ethel cried out in pain. Yet he showed no mercy. You're lying, you're deceitful, you're a wicked woman. Who would remember now that not long ago, at his birthday party. He had declared in front of everyone that he wished Auntie could be his mother and stay with Daddy forever. After all, as the Barnett family's only son and heir to the group's presidency, the Barnett group would most likely end up in his hands. In the past, he had been flattered and fawned upon. When had he ever been subjected to such contemptuous glances from others? Until Ethel, unable to bear the pain any longer, finally pushed back with all her might. After all, he was just a 5-year-old child. How could he withstand such a forceful shove from an adult? He was immediately sent tumbling backward. Ethel panted heavily, steadying herself against the table as she rose through the pain. She looked at the father and son before her, their gazes filled with nothing but disgust or hatred, and suddenly burst into laughter. "What are you laughing at?" Clark frowned deeply, his voice dripping with revulsion, yet beneath that revulsion lurked a trace of panic. Lately, Alyssa had changed far too much. In the past, no matter how angry she was, she would never have stubbornly brought such matters into public discussion, especially since Alyssa had hardly ever been angry this past year. Just like that time when he admitted in front of everyone that he still hadn't forgotten Ethel, she merely stood by watching without saying a word. How could she, who loved him so much, do something so damaging to her own dignity? "What am I laughing at?" Ethel watched him frown and laughed even louder. "I'm laughing at your hypocrisy, laughing at how you and your father are equally despicable." After viciously cursing them out, she laughed mockingly at herself. "And to think I actually believed people like you were capable of genuine feelings. Did I force you to believe my every word without questioning anything? Clark, look at me. We loved each other so deeply, so what if I framed her? She was just a political marriage pawn, a glorified nanny. How could you treat me like this for her sake?" Edward wanted to retort but found himself at a loss, helplessly turning his gaze toward Clark in hopes of guidance. She was never just a political pawn. Let alone some nanny. "That's right, you're not allowed to talk about Mom like that." Clark instinctively refuted Ethel's words, and as soon as he spoke, Edward chimed in with righteous indignation. But seeing Ethel's mocking look of surprise, father and son suddenly realized. These were the exact words Edward and himself had once used to describe Alyssa. Yes, that was indeed the evaluation they had personally given. So why did hearing those same words from others now make them inexplicably feel particularly stinging? "Clark, don't tell me you've actually fallen in love with Alyssa. And you, Edward, what's with playing the filial son now? Do you really think people have forgotten how on your birthday you called Alyssa just a nanny, saying your father and I were the perfect match?" Clark felt a flicker of confusion. Had he fallen in love with Alyssa? Glancing at the equally bewildered Edward beside him, he opened his mouth but ultimately remained silent. "No, that's not true." Edward's voice trembled with tears, his eyes glistening as he looked up at Clark, seeking validation. "You're the one who lied to us. You made us think Mom was bullying you. That's why we hated her." His words, initially faltering, gradually grew bold and righteous. His emotions surging once more, he randomly picked up a shard of broken glass from the ground and hurled it violently at her. Ethel instinctively closed her eyes. In that instant, a sharp pain shot through the corner of her eye. When she reached up to touch it, her fingers came away wet, warm, and sticky. Ethel was rushed to the hospital, but neither Clark nor Edward spared her another glance as they hurried home. Too many questions were tangled in their hearts, waiting to be asked to Alyssa. But when they pushed open the villa's door, the house stood empty. Where had she gone? Father and son searched every room, bedrooms, kitchen, bathroom, backyard, only to realize what was missing wasn't just Alyssa, but every trace of her existence. "Daddy, did Mommy abandon us?" After searching for a long time with no results, Edward pouted, tugging at Clark's suit hem with a tearful, aggrieved expression. Clark, however, had no time to comfort him. His heart was completely tangled in knots, unsure of what to do or what he should do. And he could only repeatedly dial the unmarked phone number in his contacts, but the call wouldn't go through. He had been blacklisted. Clark watched as the call automatically disconnected after a robotic female voice, staring at the string of numbers until they became ingrained in his memory from endless redialing. At that very moment, his phone suddenly rang. Clark first looked at the screen excitedly, then instantly grew despondent upon seeing the contact name Grandpa. Grandpa Barnett remained unaware of all this and asked calmly in his deep voice, "Has Alyssa left?" He remained silent for a long moment, offering no reply. Even if he didn't answer, Grandpa Barnett had long understood the answer in his heart. Now, exactly 1 month after the contract ended, Ethel's birthday banquet scandal had reached Grandpa Barnett's ears, and Alyssa's departure was even more within his expectations. He let out a heavy sigh. His tone filled with frustration at his grandson's failure to meet expectations. "I told you before, you and Ethel were never meant to be. No matter how you look at it, you two were never compatible. When you agreed to marry Alyssa and had a child with her, I truly thought you'd moved on from Ethel. But, Clark, you've really disappointed me." Clark frowned tightly, his irritation swelling with every word of Grandpa Barnett's nagging. Just as he was about to hang up, he suddenly detected something unusual in Grandpa Barnett's words. His eyes narrowed slightly, his voice growing colder. "You knew Alyssa left. Was it you who drove her away? Where have you hidden her again?" The accusations came one after another, and by the end, his emotions were spiraling out of control once more. The agony of being separated from his beloved by thousands of miles 6 years ago surged over him like a tidal wave, with bloodshot eyes. He vented all his emotions onto Grandpa Barnett, completely unaware that Edward, who had been holding him moments ago, had somehow let go of his hand and run far away, his eyes now filled with terror. Edward had never seen his father like this before. In his presence, Clark was always the composed CEO, the sharp-suited business elite, the father who hid his affection deep, never this crimson-eyed version of Clark, losing control of his emotions for who knows how many times. Even making Grandpa his punching bag, he turned and quietly ran toward the villa's exit. He couldn't just stay here waiting for death, he had to go find his mother. He didn't want this father anymore. Clark was so absorbed in his own emotions that he completely failed to notice any of this. In the past, Grandpa Barnett had indeed driven away the one he loved, leaving a lingering trace of guilt in his heart. But now, he had personally driven away his own beloved, leaving Grandpa Barnett no room to even attempt reconciliation, and naturally, no reason to shield him anymore. This time she left of her own accord, or rather, "Clark, it's you who doesn't understand love or how to respect others, which is why you drove her away so harshly." Grandpa Barnett let out a cold snort and mercilessly tore away all pretenses for him to see. "You don't actually think Alyssa has stayed by your side all these years because she truly loves you, do you?" "What do you mean?" Clark was stunned, instinctively pressing for answers, yet his subconscious already warned him. "Don't listen, Clark, you won't be able to handle this answer." He frantically reached to press the end call button. Grandpa Barnett, as if reading his thoughts at that very moment, laid out the entire truth without hesitation. "Alyssa never loved you. She was just repaying a favor, sent by me to get close to you, to pretend to love you, to bear your child. To make you forget Ethel, nothing more than a tool. I heard today Ethel got hurt, and you didn't even bother to visit her." Grandpa Barnett chuckled coldly again, giving him no chance to respond before continuing. "Seems that girl completed her mission quite well. Before she left, she even asked me to agree to let you be with Ethel. I agreed, so from now on, whatever happens between you and Ethel, I won't interfere, though looking at it now, you don't need my interference anymore." Grandpa Barnett's voice dripped with such undisguised schadenfreude that Clark couldn't pretend not to notice. His face twisted slightly, yet he stubbornly refused to concede, grinding his molars as he spat out, "I don't believe you, you're lying. Believe what you will," Grandpa Barnett replied with utter indifference. Yet it was precisely Grandpa Barnett's casual demeanor that eroded some of Clark's lingering doubts, leaving behind only boundless panic. Alyssa had never loved him. Seeing the agreement written in black and white on that flimsy contract, the thought hit Clark like a bolt from the blue, draining all strength from his body as his gaze turned vacant. "Well, are you satisfied with this truth?" Grandpa Barnett remained seated in that yellow pearwood chair, taking a slow sip of hot tea. The drifting smoke obscured Clark's expression as he sat motionless, like an inanimate object. After all, this was the grandson he had placed such high hopes on. Grandpa Barnett hadn't revealed everything to send him spiraling back into the same despair as 6 years ago, wallowing over a woman, but rather to shock him awake completely, to make him understand that emotions are merely external things, a mix of truth and falsehood, something one can have but shouldn't cling to too stubbornly. When he spoke again, Grandpa Barnett had regained his usual earnest tone, though upon closer listening, one could still detect traces of solemnity. Clark. It's not that Grandpa wants to discourage you, but you've always been too extreme in your words and actions. People must cherish what they have before them, whether it's people or anything else. No one will truly wait for you forever. I kept it from you before because I feared you couldn't accept it, but the truth is, back then, if Ethel had stood firm in her heart instead of panicking and choosing to take the money and flee abroad when I told her she'd have to give up everything the Barnett family offered her if she insisted on being with you, I could have relented, just as I'm now letting go of my interference in your relationship with her, and arranged a legitimate identity for her to marry into the Barnett family. Yet you misjudged her character and were even willing to give up your position as heir to the Barnett group for a woman like that. And then there's Alyssa. Clark, if you had shown her even a shred of sincerity these past 6 years, I refuse to believe she could have been so heartless as to disregard 6 years of companionship and abandon the child she carried for 10 months. In the end, you failed her. If I were you, the last thing I'd do now is wallow in self-pity. I'd go find her, explain myself, and make amends. Edward hid by the door, eavesdropping on every word spoken by Grandpa Barnett and Clark. The lengthy conversation overwhelmed his young mind. By the time he struggled to comprehend it all, only one sentence remained etched in his thoughts. In the end, it was you who failed her. That's why she could be so heartless as to abandon the child she carried for 10 months. So it was father who wronged mother, not as father claimed, that if not for mother, the one by his side now should have been Ethel. So all along, it was him who had misunderstood his mother. It was him who, for the sake of others, had hurt the one person in this world who should have loved him most. Tears instantly welled up in Edward's eyes. He hurriedly ran away, perhaps too flustered to remember he had been eavesdropping, and bumped into the doorknob as he turned. With a soft click, the door was pushed slightly ajar, in the study. Grandpa Barnett looked toward the doorway just in time to see a small shadowy figure darting away. As if remembering something else, he sighed and said, Edward has learned nothing of manners or filial piety from you, now even daring to speak harshly to his mother and eavesdrop. From now on, he'll stay with me, and I'll teach him myself. Grandpa Barnett made the decision alone this time, and Clark raised no objections. Only when Grandpa Barnett called for someone to follow Edward did he suddenly stand up and walk away without a word. 5 years later, New York Airport. Alyssa wore a woolen coat and oversized sunglasses that obscured most of her face, concealing her emotions entirely. Only her quick, alternating footsteps betrayed her unsettled state of mind. Behind her, Gary struggled to keep up, dragging an enormous suitcase. Hey, wait for me, Alyssa. Gary didn't bother lowering his voice at all. But his shout failed to stop the fuming Alyssa ahead. Instead, it made a man passing by her halt abruptly. He turned sharply, his eyes filled with astonishment and even a hint of disbelief. Was it just someone with the same name, or could it really be her? Countless thoughts raced wildly through his mind as he unconsciously scrutinized the woman's figure. After 6 years of marriage, they had no photos together. The gifts she had given him and Edward were later all cleared out and discarded by her. In that vast villa, he searched over and over countless times before finally giving up and accepting the fact. When she left, she erased every trace of her existence, leaving him with nothing to remember her by. Now, 5 years later, he had almost forgotten what Alyssa even looked like. Thus, when they had just passed each other by, he hadn't recognized her at all. Only upon hearing that voice call out Alyssa did he get a hint, and when he looked back at that figure, the more he looked, the more she resembled Alyssa. The surprise came so suddenly that when he opened his mouth in disbelief, he even lost his voice momentarily. Alyssa. After 5 years apart, Alyssa still recognized his voice the moment he spoke. Clark, the man who had been married to her for 6 years, bringing her 6 years of lingering nightmares. Her steps faltered slightly, and Gary, dragging his suitcase, caught up, spotting Clark frozen nearby from the corner of his eye. He couldn't help but shoot him a glare. Before Clark could react, Gary had already wrapped an arm around Alyssa's waist, guiding her toward the airport exit. Alyssa, don't be angry anymore. I made reservations at Fragrant Pavilion in advance. Let's go eat together later, okay? Hearing it was her favorite Fragrant Pavilion, Alyssa's anger had actually mostly subsided. She was just being a bit stubborn, refusing to verbally relent. Yet she didn't shake him off either, silently accepting his arrangements. The two of them tacitly pretended not to know Clark. Walking away directly, he hurried after them but froze abruptly upon seeing this scene. Finally, belatedly, he realized the unusual relationship between the two before him. Whether it was anger or sorrow, he couldn't tell. Before his mind could process it, his body had already made the choice for him. Alyssa, wait. Clark had originally intended to call out to Alyssa, but after shouting, he realized the two figures ahead were walking faster and faster until they broke into a run. He could only watch helplessly as Alyssa and Gary hopped into their car without hesitation. The moment the doors closed, they sped away, leaving him swallowing nothing but dust. With a resigned sigh, he lowered his hand, his phone still pressed to his ear as the confused voice of his business partner crackled through. Mr. Clark, Mr. Clark, are you even listening to me? By the time Clark regained his composure, the other end had long since hung up. He didn't dwell on it. Swiping his finger across the screen to dial another number. Investigate where Gary has been all these years, what he's done, and when exactly. He got in touch with Alyssa. Assistant Henry was initially puzzled about why Clark suddenly took an interest in Gary, but upon hearing his next words, his heart skipped a beat, and he hastily agreed. Alyssa's whereabouts were confidential, but Gary's weren't. Clark had searched fruitlessly for 5 years without finding a trace. Yet within 3 hours, all the materials sent by Assistant Henry fell into Clark's hands. Alyssa met Gary 2 years ago. She was just like the other researchers at the Institute, spending most of her time immersed in experiments. Only occasionally, when the professor feared they might burn out, would he forcibly give them breaks, even going so far as to lock the lab doors and windows to ensure they took time off for leisure, apart from attending award ceremonies elsewhere. She never left the lab otherwise. 2 years ago, when she went abroad with her senior classmates and accidentally got separated, she stood waiting for them to return when she unexpectedly encountered Gary. He sauntered over casually but froze for a moment upon seeing her face. Alyssa, noticing him staring intently at her face, instinctively grew wary. Without saying much, she cautiously distanced herself and later quietly warned her senior classmates when they found her. The senior students asked him a few questions, to which he gave vague answers, merely saying he knew her, yet Alyssa claimed not to recognize him, so the seniors took him for a suspicious character with ill intentions and promptly handed him over to the local police station. Looking back, it could be said they became acquainted through conflict. Later, when the misunderstanding was cleared up, their interactions gradually increased. From the very beginning, he showed an intense interest in her. The professor even welcomed his occasional invitations and seemed somewhat frustrated with the lack of initiative from the other senior students. Gary had mastered the perfect balance, never so frequent as to annoy her, nor so sparse as to let her feelings fade. Everything unfolded so naturally. He chose the night of the first snowfall to confess his feelings. Fireworks bloomed across the sky, illuminating the snow-blanketed scenery below, with no cheering crowd to witness the moment. He knelt on one knee, holding a bouquet of flowers. For a moment, she even felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Alyssa, I love you, let's be together. He gave her ample space to refuse, yet didn't skimp on the slightest bit of ceremony. She looked at him but hesitated, not reaching for the flowers. I've been married before, I have a child. She lowered her gaze, her voice still slightly hoarse. Gary discerned the unspoken final words she left hanging. Why do you like me? Gary had seriously pondered this question before deciding to confess. Unlike Clark, from the moment Alyssa first appeared by Clark's side, Gary had already known her true identity, not an admirer, not Grandpa Barnett's arranged marriage candidate sent to his side, but someone who voluntarily signed a 6-year contract with the Barnett family out of gratitude. From the perspective of an outsider, he watched her devote herself wholeheartedly to caring for Clark for 6 years. Even bearing him a child, striving with all her might to be a good wife and mother, she never seemed to consider leaving. Even when he fell in love again with his former foster sister and she was repeatedly framed, he thought she had truly fallen in love with Clark. At that time, he felt regret in his heart, and something akin to envy that Clark had a grandfather who always considered his every need and a wife who loved him. It wasn't until the farce at Ethel's birthday banquet that he finally realized how narrow-minded he had been all along. When we met again later, she had shed the reticence and submissive demeanor she had around Clark, standing there so strikingly that she commanded attention just by being present. He was drawn to her, unconsciously moving closer, his interest naturally piqued. Until now, he could say with certainty that his feelings weren't fleeting. Nor were they some childish desire to compete with Clark. It was simply because, at this moment, she was herself, only her. Alyssa, I know everything. And that's why I know I like you. Nothing will change that. Everything I'm doing now is only because I like you. The sincerity in his eyes left her unable to utter a refusal. Once, because of that 6-year contract. Because Clark never once opened his heart from beginning to end. Because the child she carried for 10 months went from indifference to outright dislike. She had even begun to wonder if she was simply unfit for family life. But now, gazing into his eyes, she suddenly felt that perhaps she could try one more time. The worst outcome would simply be retreading the same path she'd walked before, so she reached out and took the bouquet he offered, 99 red roses, even more dazzling against the snowy night. A faint smile curled at the corners of her lips. Stunning him momentarily, everything fell into place so naturally. She accepted his confession, and they became an official couple. From then on, traces of him always accompanied her wherever she appeared, and today happened to be Alyssa and Gary's 1-year anniversary. The reason she got upset earlier was simply because she found out that Gary had pulled several all-nighters to finish all his work so he could make time to celebrate their anniversary with her in New York without worries. Ultimately, Alyssa was just heartbroken over Gary's exhaustion. Looking at the documents and photos sent by his assistant, the Alyssa in them was so vibrant, completely different from how she was around him. Clark felt an indescribable complexity in his heart. As if a vat of vinegar had been overturned, the sourness overwhelming. What made it even harder to accept was that now Gary was her official boyfriend. While he himself was nothing, he opened the glove compartment and took out that maroon divorce certificate, never regretting anything more than the moment he'd given Alyssa that signed divorce agreement when they married. Why had he never thought to settle down properly during those 6 years and live a good life with Alyssa? Why, after Ethel returned to the country, did he not only drift away himself but also lead Edward astray from her? Otherwise, how could he have reached this point, finally seeing her again only to realize he couldn't even find an excuse to meet her, while she had long since let go of their past and started a brand new life? Alyssa was completely unaware of Clark's inner thoughts. At this moment, she was seated in a private room at the Fragrant Cuisine Pavilion, being personally served by the president of the Roderick Corporation. The freshly boiled ingredients still steamed with heat. Wrapped in the hot pot dipping sauce personally prepared by Gary, a single bite dispelled the chill in her body and left her thoroughly satisfied. Feeling magnanimous, she picked up a piece of meat, boiled it, coated it in sauce, and fed it to him. Gary didn't hesitate, eating it directly from her chopsticks. Though his gaze never left her, she grew slightly flustered under his stare and slapped him lightly in annoyance. Eat properly. Why are you staring at me? Because you're beautiful. Even after being hit, he didn't look away, still grinning roguishly. That punchable look made Alyssa itch to hit him for a moment. She clenched her fist but ultimately held back, fearing it might actually please him. His scheme foiled, Gary revealed a trace of disappointment in his eyes. At this, Alyssa felt even more relieved she hadn't continued hitting him earlier. The two continued their playful banter while eating, and by the time they finished, a full hour had slipped by unnoticed. Just as she was about to rise, the private room's door suddenly swung open. Alyssa subconsciously furrowed her brows, initially assuming it was a waiter. She was about to ask why they hadn't knocked when her gaze lifted and met Clark standing at the doorway, and by his side stood Edward, who had already grown up to his waist. 5 years had passed since they last met. He had transformed from a little sprout into a young boy. His appearance changed considerably, and his entire demeanor had grown more reserved, no longer the boisterous child he once was, now resembling a proper little adult. Even without deliberately keeping tabs, Alyssa would inevitably catch news of them from all sorts of places. Some say Clark loved his wife deeply, while others claim Edward was clever, showing glimpses of his father's shadow even at a young age. She always remained non-committal about such rumors. Though those around her never forgot how they had once believed hearsay to condemn the first wife, even harming Alyssa in the process. Deep love, people like them dictate their own narratives, just like how they pushed aside the first wife for the sake of an adopted sister. As for the younger one, he doesn't take after his father's madness, blindly obeying the mistress's words and even slapping his own mother for her sake. But didn't they say that adopted sister who drove the father and son mad never ended up marrying into the Barnett family, nor even kept her status as an adopted sister? Who knows what they were thinking? They drove away their original partner to be with that person, and when the other finally stepped aside as they wished, they turned around and kicked them out. It's just that every time they met before, it was always through a screen, now, face to face. Alyssa finally felt the tangible passage of time. So, Edward had already grown this big. Gary noticed her distraction, squeezed the hand he was holding, and shifted his position from across her to her side. With his other arm, he draped it over Alyssa's shoulder, pulling her closer to him. The whole sequence of actions carried an unmistakable air of possessiveness. When he looked up again, the challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. Alyssa didn't stop him. Instead, she withdrew her gaze from Edward and obediently shifted closer to Gary. That tiny movement alone made Edward's eyes instantly redden. His lips quivered, eyes brimming with unmistakable grievance. "Mom, I miss you so much. Why haven't you come looking for me all these years?" He wept like a child abandoned by his mother, pitiful and helpless. The passing crowd quickly noticed the commotion and cast glances their way. Clark keenly sensed those gazes, holding Edward's hand. He stepped into the private booth and closed the door behind them, shutting out all prying eyes. Edward instinctively tried to rush toward Alyssa upon entering, but Gary swiftly intercepted him. Hey, what are you doing? Talk if you want to talk, but keep your hands to yourself. She's my mother. What right do you have to stop me from approaching her?" Edward glared at him furiously, his words brimming with righteous indignation. Ever since learning of Alyssa's whereabouts, he had rushed non-stop to New York, terrified that moving too slowly might mean losing Alyssa all over again. After 5 years by Grandpa Barnett's side, he'd mastered many skills. Hiding and disguising himself had become second nature. Just as he'd deceived Grandpa Barnett by playing the obedient grandson before boarding a private jet straight to New York, along the way, Edward had imagined many scenarios of reuniting with his mother. He thought Alyssa might regret abandoning him, or that she might still be angry, but if he apologized sincerely, she would forgive him. But he didn't. Alyssa remained standing in place, subtly avoiding his approach before slowly shaking her head. "I'm not your mother, Edward. Have you forgotten who you chose to be your mother?" Edward's face instantly paled. Clark quickly stepped forward, taking Edward's hand, his tone carrying disapproval. "Alyssa, I know you resent us all, but he's still young. He made mistakes and said wrong things in the past, but isn't the most important thing the ability to learn from them? Why must you say such hurtful words to him?" Alyssa finally raised her head, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since their reunion. "Mr. Clark, we're already divorced. Given our current relationship, we're not close enough to use pet names. Mr. Clark, please call me Miss Alyssa from now on, otherwise, my boyfriend might get jealous." Her aloof demeanor drew a clear boundary between them, yet the casually mentioned word boyfriend struck his heart like a sledgehammer. Clark hadn't just learned about their relationship, but the impact of written records could never compare to hearing it from her own lips. Her expression was indifferent, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a daze, as if seeing their past selves only with their positions reversed. Back then, the one who held the upper hand in their relationship had been him. At that time, Clark had also kept others at arm's length like this, facing Alyssa, who had been content with just a marriage certificate and a wedding ring. No ceremony, no honeymoon. He had loftily produced a pre-signed divorce agreement and said to her, "I know you like me, but my heart has long belonged to someone else. Marrying you was only because my family pressured me. I've already signed this divorce agreement. Whenever you want a divorce, just sign here. You're free to leave anytime." Back then, he had spoken so shamelessly, never imagining that one day, the one bowing his head to beg for reconciliation would be himself. Times had changed, and now he finally understood how she had felt back then. At this thought, Clark suddenly let out a self-mocking laugh. No, how could Alyssa have been sad back then? divorce was such a hassle. She had only signed the contract and tied her fate to his to repay Barnett family's kindness in funding her education. When he gave her the freedom to leave, she must have been happy. Clark opened his mouth, only to feel his throat tighten with bitterness, unable to voice the countless words trapped within. After all, from the very beginning, both he and Edward had already been shut out of her world. "Mom, do you really not want me anymore?" Edward still refused to give up, pressing further, but Alyssa was already growing impatient. Without hesitation, she took Gary's hand and stood up, ready to step past them and leave. The next moment, Edward clung to her leg desperately, arms and legs wrapped around her as he burst into loud sobs. "Mom, I know I was wrong. It was my fault before I failed you. Mom, please, just give me one more chance, okay? I swear, from now on I'll listen to you. I'll take care of you properly. Please don't abandon me, okay?" Clark quickly blocked her path, his eyes reddening at the corners. "Alyssa, it's my fault. I failed to recognize my own feelings and took advantage of your love to hurt you repeatedly." "No, wait, it wasn't even love. I only learned later from Grandpa that you came to my side just to repay a debt of gratitude." He fought back tears, his eyes turning red with the effort. "Alyssa, both Edward and I know we were wrong. Can you forgive us? Give us another chance to start over. This time, you don't have to love us, just come back to us. Edward and I will agree to anything you say." Edward nodded eagerly, chiming in, "Mom, 5 years ago, you gave me that safe. I found the key later and saw everything inside. There were numbers written on them. They were birthday gifts you prepared for me in advance, weren't they? I've been good, opening only one each year. You couldn't bear to leave me either, could you? Come back to us, please." He blinked his eyes, looking both pitiful and aggrieved. Hearing Edward mention that safe, Alyssa was momentarily stunned. She had thought she'd long since thrown everything away. Upon careful recollection, she remembered that at the time, she'd figured since the keys were already lost, whether the safe was discarded or not seemed irrelevant. Never would she have imagined that Edward, who had discarded it so decisively back then, would actually go retrieve the keys. Just as Alyssa was lost in thought, Gary spoke up with clear dissatisfaction. "Do you really think I don't exist? Poaching right under my nose, Clark. When did I ever give you the impression I'm this easygoing?" Clark completely ignored him, still gazing at Alyssa, awaiting her response with a mix of nervousness and excitement. As for Gary, they were sworn enemies anyway. What did it matter if he hated him even more? All he wanted now was Alyssa, and nothing else. Moreover, Gary couldn't possibly be unaware of their relationship with Alyssa while pursuing her. As the two argued, Alyssa looked down at Edward, who still clung to her stubbornly. His eyes filled with pleading. If it were 5 years ago, before Ethel had returned, and they had begged her like this with promises, Alyssa might have actually softened. But now, after all that had happened, Alyssa no longer placed them in the most important position. Family was important, but she herself mattered more. "No one in this world is obligated to wait forever for you to repent. Before I became a mother, I was my own person first." Alyssa pried Edward's arms away from her and shook her head, as if speaking to him while also answering Clark. "I lost myself for a long time in the past, but now I've not only found myself again but also met a partner who truly complements me. Why should I abandon my current life and relationship just because you've had a change of heart?" Alyssa left after all, together with Gary. Clark wanted to chase after her, but Grandpa Barnett suddenly called. "President Han couldn't reach you and contacted me instead. Clark, who taught you to lose your composure over personal matters and stand up our business partners." Only at this moment did Clark finally remember that he had originally come to New York on business. If the collaboration with MT Group proceeded smoothly, the Barnetts could successfully break into New York's market, and the Barnett family's enterprises would reach new heights. And now, the agreed time had long passed. He remained silent for a moment, watching as Alyssa and Gary gradually faded into the distance until they completely disappeared from sight. His heart seethed with unbearable frustration. Edward also stared at him, eyes filled with confusion, as if questioning why he didn't give chase. "Is Edward with you now?" On the other end, Grandpa Barnett suddenly shifted the topic, asking about Edward again. He grunted in acknowledgement, making no attempt to conceal the truth. After all, Edward had come to New York on Grandpa Barnett's private jet. Figuring out his description couldn't be simpler. You saw her, with the child. What did she say to you? And what do you plan to do next? His voice carried a hint of displeasure, directed not just at him, but at Edward and Alyssa as well. Clark, I sent her to you back then so you could forget Ethel, not to let her become a second Ethel. Do you understand? Grandpa Barnett's implication was clear. If Clark kept letting personal matters interfere with business, Grandpa Barnett couldn't guarantee he wouldn't intervene again. Don't you dare bully my mom. Edward, with sharp ears, caught the last sentence. As the great-grandson he personally raised, he quickly grasped the meaning behind those words, and his emotions began to stir. If you care so much about Alyssa, what you should be doing now isn't talking back to me, but hurrying back. And tell your unreliable father to stop confusing priorities. Clark frowned, his tone full of disapproval. You were the one who said I should go find her first to make things clear and apologize. Why is it said now that he can't distinguish between what's urgent and what's important, what is light, what is heavy, what can wait, and what must be urgent? Why should his entire life be lived for the company? Why should Grandpa Barnett have the power to send away the person he loves at will, demand an arranged marriage, forbid him from wallowing in despair, and force him to bury himself in work when his heartbreak couldn't be mended? I did that to pull you out of your despair, Grandpa Barnett snapped angrily. He never expected that after 5 years, his well-intentioned advice would be thrown back in his face. Clark, don't forget you're now the CEO of Barnett Group. Every move you make represents Barnett Group. Clark felt more certain of himself than ever, even more so than when he had vowed to renounce his position as heir to Barnett Group to stay with Ethel all those years ago. I've said it before, I never wanted this position. A sense of helplessness rose in his heart again. Grandpa Barnett began doubting for the first time where exactly his parenting had gone wrong to raise such a stubborn, inflexible grandson. After a long silence, he suddenly laughed. Do you think I can't do without you? Fine, if you insist on charging down this reckless path, I won't stop you, but you must send Edward back to me by today. The threat in his words was unmistakable, yet the other man exhaled deeply as if granted pardon. I'll have him return immediately. The next morning, Alyssa woke from her sleep and habitually checked her phone for the time. The next second, countless missed calls flooded her phone, so many that her device froze momentarily. Her first thought was that something had happened at the research institute. In a panic, she quickly washed up, changed clothes, and was about to rush out. What's going on? Why the hurry? Gary, wearing an apron, heard the commotion and stepped out of the kitchen. Seeing her flustered state, he looked puzzled but still remembered to hand her the milk he had kept warm nearby. Have something to drink first, it'll settle your stomach. I just noticed all those missed calls, probably something's wrong at the institute. I should go check. She took a sip of milk with her messy bedhead, mumbling an explanation before suddenly realizing something was off. The apartment was right near the research institute. If there had been some urgent matter requiring so many calls, her seniors likely wouldn't have waited for her to wake up naturally. They'd have come knocking long ago instead of giving up after failed calls. Her tense nerves relaxed all at once. She exhaled deeply, and only after calming down did she have the presence of mind to check who had actually called. Seeing her like this, Gary amusedly steadied her shoulders and guided her to sit at the dining table before turning to bring her a plate of fried eggs. If it's not related to the institute, then let's eat while we look into it. Those missed calls weren't from the same number, but each one had dialed repeatedly. Whether it was a prank or someone genuinely having an urgent matter remained unclear. She opened the text messages next, greeted by a long string of red alerts, each containing just one brief sentence. Edward is missing. After reading the text message clearly, Alyssa's mind suddenly went blank. Missing. What does that mean? But it was these very messages that gave her some clue about those missed calls. Clark. She hurriedly scrolled to the first incoming number and dialed back. The moment the call connected, she blurted out, "What exactly happened?" Clark felt a surge of bitterness in his heart, but he didn't dare delay and recounted the events exactly as they had happened. Grandpa told me to send Edward back. I put him on the plane, but Butler Ray said he waited for a long time. But Edward never arrived. Then the other bodyguards escorting Edward back came running out, saying Edward had been kidnapped. Alyssa, I'm sorry, I failed to protect our child. At this moment, Clark felt indescribably conflicted. He didn't know whether to rage over who would dare kidnap Edward right under his and Grandpa Barnett's noses, or to grieve that now only Edward's kidnapping could make Alyssa reach out to him. She frowned, her heart growing increasingly agitated. Edward was kidnapped. Gary set down another breakfast plate beside her and happened to catch Clark's voice on the phone. After hesitating for a moment, he asked, "In LA, do you need my help?" It wasn't that he had spare energy to meddle in the Barnett family's affairs, but he could see that Edward was, after all, Alyssa's child carried for 10 months. She might have grown cold toward him because of his past actions and wouldn't soften or forgive him just because he apologized. But when Edward faced danger, even mortal danger, she couldn't simply stand aside. In the end, she was just an ordinary person, incapable of such utter ruthlessness. "Thank you." But before Gary could even begin investigating, Clark received a message sent from an unknown number. Its contents brief: "Edward is in my hands. If you want him alive, meet me at port tomorrow at noon. If you dare call the police, I'll make sure he dies with me." A single sentence made Alyssa's heart leap into her throat. If kidnappers aren't demanding ransom, what else could they possibly want? Alyssa and Gary flew back to LA overnight. By noon the next day, they arrived at port right on time. The harbor waters were calm at this moment, with all large vessels already out at sea. Only a small boat remained, tethered to the dock with a thin rope, bobbing gently on the surface. On the boat, only two figures, one large, one small, were visible. Clearly, these were the kidnappers they had been searching for, the one who had kidnapped Edward. Clark and Alyssa Gary recognized instantly. "Ethel," all three exclaimed in unison. Clark furrowing his brow deeply as he spoke with unmistakable irritation. "Ethel, what exactly are you trying to do?" Hearing the voice, Ethel turned her head. With nothing to shield her, the long scar at the corner of her eye fell into everyone's sight. The unconscious and tightly bound Edward was placed in front of her as cover. She froze momentarily upon seeing the three people opposite her, but soon, the madness in her eyes became even more apparent. "Alyssa, you actually came back too." Seeing her focus her gaze on Alyssa, Clark and Gary instinctively shielded her. "Speak, what will it take for you to release Edward?" Looking at Alyssa firmly shielded behind the two of them, Ethel tasted jealousy for the first time. Rage churned violently in her chest, the resentment in her eyes nearly materializing. She couldn't understand, both were cast out of the Barnett family. So why was she the only one left in such wretchedness? The scar at the corner of her eye didn't have to remain. The Barnett family had been utterly heartless, merely stopping her bleeding before driving her out of the hospital. Stripped of her name, all her assets frozen, she was left with a hideous, indelible scar on her face and nowhere to go, reduced to scavenging through trash bins for scraps to survive. What about Alyssa? Dressed in luxury brands, her face even more stunning than before she was kicked out of the Barnett family. As if that weren't enough, even Clark and Gary are all protecting her. She couldn't accept it. "Didn't you ask what I want to do?" Ethel approached Edward with a dagger in one hand while dragging Edward toward the ship's edge with the other, her face revealing pure malice directed at Alyssa. "I only have two conditions. Fulfill them, and I'll let Edward go. First, I want you to marry me. 2. Exchange Alyssa for Edward." Ethel fixed her gaze intently on Clark, placing the choice squarely in Clark's hands. Should he marry her and let her kill Alyssa to vent her anger, sparing Alyssa's bastard child for now, or choose Edward to die? As her words fell, silence instantly enveloped the surroundings, leaving only the ceaseless howling of the wind. Handing over Alyssa was never within Clark's vast Gary's options, but neither could they simply give up Edward. "The first one is acceptable, the second is not. Make another demand." Moments later, seeing Clark still standing frozen in place, Gary shook his head, refusing outright. Hearing this, Clark was instantly on the verge of exploding. Just as he was about to refuse outright, he faltered under the gazes of Gary and Alyssa. Ethel naturally noticed Clark's reluctance. Biting her lip, her anger grew even fiercer, making her even more unwilling to back down. As the standoff continued, Ethel suddenly seemed to sense something and turned to look at them with sudden alertness. "You're not trying to stall for time, are you? I told you, if you dare call the police, I'll make sure he dies with me." By the end, her voice had actually begun to tremble, and the calm composure of the three people opposite her only made her panic more. Her fear showed. and her grip on the dagger unconsciously tightened. Thin trails of blood seeped from Edward's delicate neck. The pain jolting him awake from unconsciousness, the next second, he began wailing uncontrollably, "Mommy, save me." The piercing wail made Alyssa's heart tremble. She gazed into the distance, her heart pounding wildly, praying silently that the police could rescue him safely. But she wouldn't exchange herself for him. "Stop crying. Cry again and I'll kill you." She hadn't expected Edward to wake up suddenly. The shrill crying grated on her nerves, just as she meant to check Clark's reaction. An accidental glance revealed the dark barrel of a gun pointed straight at her. Never a hardened criminal to begin with, boundless terror overwhelmed her at this sight. The pressure of her grip began slipping beyond control as Ethel's mind emptied until only a few phrases remained. They called the police. They still called the police. She will die. Ethel didn't want to die, but panic left her unable to think. She could only instinctively tighten her grip on her sole lifeline and shrink herself as small as possible. Panicking about how to survive, her gaze fell upon Alyssa's eyes, which despite desperate attempts to conceal it, still revealed deep concern when suddenly a mad idea seized her mind. If she was destined to die tonight, then let them all accompany her to the grave. The cries and shouts continued, but Ethel no longer felt irritated. She merely tightened her grip on him and raised her eyes to meet theirs. "I know you've called the police, so I've changed my mind. I want all of you on board. Once we reach safety, I'll leave alone." Perhaps because she had made her decision, Ethel had never felt her mind so clear. After hesitating for a moment, the first to step forward was Clark, followed closely by Alyssa and Gary. Protected between the two, she watched Edward trying to shield Ethel on the sea surface. And a sense of foreboding suddenly spread through her. As they drew closer, that feeling grew stronger and stronger. Finally, when they reached the edge of the harbor, she suddenly tightened her grip on Gary's sleeve. "I can't shake the feeling that her intentions go beyond just leaving." As her hushed words faded, Clark boarded the ship. The next second, Ethel lunged without warning. With a sickening squelch, the sharp dagger plunged into Clark's throat, followed by bang, the gunshot rang out. Alyssa instinctively turned her head, only for her eyes to be covered by a pair of large, warm hands. Gary's trembling voice reached her ears. "Don't look." 3 consecutive splashes followed, and the crying abruptly ceased. Police and rescue personnel, who had been lying in ambush nearby, arrived in the blink of an eye. A few more splashes sounded. Alyssa pulled down Gary's hands forcefully, only to see, besides the pool of bright red blood on the small wooden boat, nothing but rescue divers tethered by safety ropes, diving intermittently to search for the 3 who had just plunged into the water. "Edward, Alyssa." Before she could finish her sentence, she suddenly felt a tightness in her chest. Her vision went black, and her body went limp as she collapsed. The last thing she heard was Gary's fading cry of alarm. Alyssa didn't wake up until 2 days later. The pungent smell of disinfectant made her momentarily disoriented. She had almost forgotten when was the last time she'd been hospitalized. She slightly curled her fingers, and Gary, who was holding her hand by the hospital bed, startled awake. The TV hanging on the wall was broadcasting the latest news, with bold headlines at the bottom clearly displaying, "Barnett family's former foster daughter, harboring resentment after being kicked out, plotted revenge," resulting in the drowning deaths of both the Barnett family conglomerate's president and his son. Gary turned toward the sound and saw the report. He quickly changed channels, flipping through several, only to find each broadcasting the same news. Sheepishly, he turned off the TV, annoyed he hadn't done so sooner. "It's none of your business." Alyssa shook her head. To be fair, this matter had nothing to do with Gary from beginning to end. Ethel's resentment was sown by Clark and Edward themselves, father and son. Now that they're reaping what they sowed, they can't blame anyone else. After a moment of silence, she looked up, her voice still weak. "I want to go see them." Death severs all ties. From then on, dust returned to dust and earth to earth between them. All grievances dissolved, all passions vanished. Alyssa never got to see Clark and Edward one last time. Grandpa Barnett stopped her at the funeral home entrance, his clouded eyes waving them away. "Go back, all of you, go back." The white-haired mourned the black-haired, unsure whether to resent the tangled web of love and hate between them that claimed the lives of the younger generation, or to resent his own stubbornness that drove everyone to this bitter end. The night stretched endlessly as fireworks bloomed above the city. This new year does not belong to them.